Hi, my name is Cricket Harbeck and I'm an art conservator from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I specialize in preserving and restoring objects and sculpture. I've been in the art conservation business for about 25 years. I started out working for museums, and for the last 20 years I've been in private practice. People often ask what my background is, so I thought I'd share a little bit of that with you. I went to college and studied studio art and art history. After college I graduated and found out about art conservation, so I went back to school for a couple years and studied chemistry. That allowed me to get into an art conservation program, which is a master's program. That was a 3-year intensive training on all aspects of art conservation, including paper, painting, and sculpture. Since then, I've worked on a variety of different projects. Mostly I've worked on archaeological and ethnographic materials, but now that I'm in private practice, I do a whole range of things like outdoor sculpture. I work a lot with decorative arts like Tiffany and Victorian collections. I also work with a large collection of Asian funerary art that's mostly bronze and ceramics. So as a private conservator, I work just on a wonderful array of different things. I thought I would start by just talking how I got involved in the project and my history with the Laredo Taft dioramas. Way back in 2018, I was working with the Kenosha Public Museum and conserved their set of 8 dioramas. And at the very tail end of it, by some crazy luck, Pam and Fred Page contacted Kenosha and was asking them about their collection of dioramas at Elmwood. And so Kenosha put me in touch with Fred and Pam, and I came down in 2018 and did a site visit and an original assessment of all these cabinets. Originally, all of these dioramas were located or stored next door in the Page's garage, and so I spent a day with them kind of climbing around, looking into cabinets. All the figures that populate the dioramas were in boxes, so we unpacked many of those and looked at them and looked at the condition. I took a lot of notes, a lot of pictures, went back to my studio in Milwaukee and spent a couple weeks figuring out a treatment proposal and a plan of action based a lot on the work I had done in Kenosha. So this project was unique in that, unlike Kenosha, which was already displaying their dioramas, this project involved reimagining, or not reimagining, but imagining a display of these dioramas. What you all have done is built this beautiful gallery space where in the middle all the dioramas are housed, and you can walk around in a U-shaped configuration and look into each one of those. So I just wanted to highlight some of the work that's been done, not only by me in terms of the restoration and preservation, but also just for the whole project in its entirety. And I'm going to point out some things if that's okay. Okay, so I wanted to start by just giving an overview of the project and some of the things we worked on as a whole to put this up in an exhibit. To begin with, all of the dioramas were put on a pedestal. They were put on these hardy wood pedestals that have locking rolling casters, which helps facilitate us moving them when we need to move them. That was made by a local carpenter. I brought a colleague of mine, Emilio Bras, down. We worked together at the Milwaukee Public Museum, and he specializes in exhibits. He came down for several days and upgraded all the lighting that was in the cabinet. So one of the great things about these dioramas is that they had the original light fixtures in them. But when you crawl in and actually look at where the light fixtures were, you can see, because they were old tungsten bulbs, that they had actually burned sections in the roofs of the diorama and sometimes in the wood cabinets themselves. So the exterior of all these dioramas is a plywood, and sometimes those lights were so close to the wood that it actually charred sections around the wood. So as you can imagine, that's a safety hazard. So we replaced all of those And Emilio came in and engineered a lighting system that uses LED and put them all on a rheostat so we could adjust to the light levels. And we went to our desired light levels. So once the lights were installed, we worked together to figure out exactly how we wanted to light the dioramas. The great thing about what Emilio did was he actually put the lights where they originally were, which is unusual because the Kenosha Public Museum dioramas had gone and retrofitted their cabinets and just put fiber optic lighting, but not where originally Laredo Taft had put the lighting. So I think this is a great improvement, or a great, staying true to how Laredo Taft would have lit these. It's kind of a great improvement and safety measure for these. Another thing that we did, I'm going to jump around a little bit, but the cabinets nearest the door each had these. We created little windows inside the cabinets, storage chambers, because what we're going to do is, in the process of restoring everything, we found a lot of debris or material, or took samples of things we found in the cabinet and saved everything. So what I'm showing you is actually a container with an inventory list that we've created, and each one of these bags is annotated with what diorama it came from and what we discovered in them. So this is a bag of nails that we found just in the bottom of, this one is from the studio of Phidias. So part of the conservation process is to preserve all the information, not to throw anything out, and to kind of identify it, because we always have a look towards future research. So somebody that ever wants to come in and look at everything, they'll have it there. So that's one of our important things. So the idea is that when we're all done and I'm finished collecting material, we'll just scoot those in here and keep it all together. The importance of that is that we just don't lose information. So you don't want to put it somewhere, in a whole different facility, in a storage cabinet, and nobody, because it's disassociated, nobody ever finds it again. So we're also doing that with all the original lighting. So all the original lighting that we took out, that Emilio took out, we've labeled, we've documented. So I've taken photographs of them. We have an inventory. We labeled where they're from again, and we're going to store them all in this also. So that's part of the kind of unsexy part of conservation. So these were our two big movements, having the pedestals made and having the lighting upgraded. We also worked with the local carpenter, Fred Lance. He helped us a lot with some of the structural repairs to the cabinets themselves. The way the dioramas are made is that it's basically a wood shell, and with a plaster interior, a plaster form interior. And you can an example is best, when you look at the back side of the Donatello studio, you can see how that's all fabricated. Basically, it's pieces of wood that plaster is molded around, and they've laid a floor of plaster with, organic plant material in it to fortify it. All the figures are plaster. A lot of the figures have an iron rod armature in them to keep them, sort of stiff and hardy, or structurally stable, really. So basically all of these, the interior of all the cabinets are plaster that have then been sealed, with a sealant, like shellac is one of the things we've identified, and then painted. So that's why they're polychrome, they're multicolored. So, but we've worked with Fred Lance, so he helped us stabilize and put together some of the cabinetry. He also helped us with some of the restoration work. And by that, part of the process of restoring this is we studied a lot of old photographs. So we looked, I searched archives with the help of Fred and Pam, found old pictures, and one of my favorites over here, which I'll show you in a minute. And we studied where everything was. We did an inventory of everything that we, had here in Elmwood from all the boxes. and we figured out what was missing. And I can point out a couple examples where Fred helped us and where the Kenosha Public Museum helped us. Can I just make them? So basically this is the interior of Donatello's studio, and every surface in here is plaster. Some of it has been fortified with like a plant material to give it strength, and it's sort of like using rebar and concrete. A lot of those figures have a wire armature in them, and what we're finding during the whole treatment and examination phase is just sort of the interesting way that these things are made. So it's plaster, but then because of this one break in the floor, you know, you see this big huge dent with all this loss in here. But what we find is this kind of orange brown area. That's actually, when I look at it under UV fluorescence, it fluoresces a bright orange, which is indicative of shellac. So I think how they constructed these is they poured, you know, a plaster base and then shellacked it, which is to, you know, to seal it. And then you can see these score marks in it. And then they laid a veneer of plaster over that, which was just a pure plaster, and then they coated that plaster and then painted it this, you know, the floor color green. What you're seeing here, so this is an interesting area, and I'll go off on a little bit of a tangent. But when I first started working on this diorama, this floor was so dirty it looked black. And what I thought was really interesting was it was so black that that's all I saw. I didn't see any differentiation in color. So the interesting thing is when I started cleaning it, I did a spot cleaning test and realized that the floor actually is this kind of lighter gray-green color. But what somebody did was, because there must have been damage here, somebody needed to touch it up and painted it the dirt color. So that's why they painted it this dark gray color. It was just to match the dirt. So I just thought that was an interesting aside. But what's fun about this is actually learning how Taft would have fabricated these, because that plays into a lot of what materials and methods I can use to preserve them. And I'll circle back to the idea. You know, I mentioned earlier that I had a couple years of chemistry. So I had general chemistry and organic to get into conservation. And why that is important is that conservation really is a marriage of science and art. So I have an art and art history background, but I needed science, chemistry being key, but physics, biology, geology, to understand just sort of the breadth of materials that I'm confronted with daily. So chemistry is important because you need to understand, you know, basically how things are made, with their chemical and physical interaction, what materials I can use to restore and preserve them without actually affecting or changing them, because in general my impact in conservation is minimal. You know, I want to intervene as little as possible. I want to show my hand as little as possible. I want to preserve things in their entirety and not remove any original content unless I have to. And that's, you know, where it comes into play, you know, the importance too, as in here, the importance of understanding what's a previous restoration versus originally applied by the artist. So, you know, that's where the whole science comes into play with art conservation. It's just basically understanding how things are fabricated, how they change over time, and what I can do to help them, to preserve them, versus, you know, adding a material that will cause decay or destruction down the road. You know, like, as a little bit of a tangent, the materials that we use in conservation have, you know, there's a field of conservation science, and they have been well tested and well vetted. You know, we have extensive papers written about materials and techniques. So on one hand, conservation is highly creative in figuring out it's problem solving and figuring out what to do, but on the other hand, it's all based on science and research and understanding, the materials and methods that we're using. And as an example, one of the adhesives that I use in this repair, everything is custom made from pure ingredients. I'm not typically buying anything over the counter like an Elmer's glue or a Gorilla Glue or something to put back together. I'm actually in my studio mixing up a pure resin with a solvent, and I choose the solvent specifically knowing the characteristic of the material that I'm using. So, for instance, one of the varnishes that I'm using here, I have in a solvent that won't dissolve the shellac. So that's kind of an example of the way we work. So these are kind of all the little things we think about in art conservation. So Taft designed these dioramas to work two ways in populating them with the figures. One of the ways is he created these cavities that the figures sit in. So like this figure perfectly nests in here into this opening. The other way, which is what I showed earlier, was that the figures simply sit on the display deck like this one. And that's where those annotations on the deck come into play so that we know where to put them. So I just wanted to point this out, that this is an example of the old lighting system. So this is one of the old lighting wires that was cut a long time ago, probably when they deinstalled it from the Dayton Art Museum. But that shows you some of how this was originally put together. One of the really fun things that I wanted to point out that I discovered when cleaning these is that in removing all those grime layers, I actually found annotations on the floor of where the figures went. And if you can zoom in closely, you can see it's a pencil outline, and sometimes there's a red ink outline that shows what figure went where. So I know that this figure originally would have been placed here. And I think that these were done, I don't know who did these, but I know Kenosha Public Museum also has them. But what's interesting about them is that the way Kenosha is set up, the dioramas aren't exactly the same. So in this diorama, this figure, the annotation shows that he's facing the wall, and actually what he's doing is facing the mirror. In Kenosha, he's turned 180 degrees and is facing outward. But this is one of, these annotations and the process of conservation is one of those situations where, you just need to go slow and carefully so that you don't blow through something and remove all of this historical information, but then find a way, to clean everything, to preserve it, but then preserve it for historical context, because this to me is a very, intimate detail of how this was put together. Somebody came in and hand lettered all of these. Some of these, there's a figure over here. There would have been a statue over here. Somebody's written Matthew, so we know that that's where the statue of Matthew went. So that is part of the process, and why, conservation itself takes so long in treating, is that I needed to go carefully through the floor, not only to clean it, but then to make sure I was preserving all of this historical information. I'll take this time also just to talk about the cleaning, because cleaning really has been a major part of this project. These cabinets had been stored uncovered for many years in the garage next door, and had also kind of survived the industrial age in museums. So they had layers and layers and layers of dirt. To unpack that, I did layers and layers and layers of treatment. And that's, that's a conservation principle, is you go gently and carefully through something versus finding, a magic bullet to do everything all at once. Oftentimes. There's exceptions, of course, but oftentimes that's the case. So, at the start of this project, the cleaning was a lot of dusting and vacuuming and getting up all the loose debris. I showed you that box of collection of materials. I carefully went through and collected any bits of materials and labeled where I got them from, what part of the diorama they came from, if they were under something, if they're in this corner. Part of the process also, stepping back a little bit, was just doing a lot of documentation. There's a lot of photography involved with this. So before treatment, before I did anything, I took a lot of photographs of how everything looked, as well as doing a written assessment and careful condition assessment that documents, fractures and cracks and losses and discoloration and all of that kind of, data. But getting back to cleaning, so, first I started with basically, dust and particulate removal, which is vacuuming. And then I sort of gently moved up the ladder and, did dry cleaning methods with sponges and erasers and anything to lift the dust out. I got to a point where I still had a heavy dark gray layer. So then I started doing a lot of chemical testing and tested a lot of different surfactants, basically soaps and chelators and, just a variety of different chemicals, mostly water-based, but some solvent-based, trying to figure out, what would be the thing that would work the best, that would be the gentlest, that wouldn't damage, getting back to chemistry, that wouldn't damage the paint and the plaster's layers. Finally, I came on something, basically a category of something that worked, which was a combination of a chelator and a surfactant, but then had to figure out then a technique to do it and how to actually employ it. So was I going to do it with cotton swabs? Was I going to do it with brushes? Was I going to do it with cosmetic sponges? And what I found was that each area behaved differently. So I could do one thing one way, but one thing not another way. So that's partly why conservation is kind of a slow and steady process, because at the end of the day, the last thing I want to do is damage the artwork. So that was the cleaning phase of it. I'm pretty much done with Donatello's Studio, which is the last one that I'm working on in the series. And, my next step is then to go into a lot of these structural repairs and kind of what I call, cosmetic, touch-ups. I do want to point out, since we're talking about it, kind of the fine difference between conservation and restoration, which is, in this instance, in some regards, I am restoring it, but I'm not trying to restore it as if it just came out of Taft's studio. That's not at all my goal. My goal is to make it look well taken care of, to clean it, to document it well, to stabilize it. Stabilizing, I mean by repairing things, getting rid of corrosion, getting rid of any instabilities in the structure. But what I don't want to do is, originally a lot of these architectural elements in Donatello's Studio and throughout, the other dioramas, they were basically supposed to look like marble. And so when they were originally fabricated, they were basically probably like a white plaster that was then coated. They sealed it just so that the plaster wouldn't get grimy and dirty and absorb all that dust. But over time, a lot of that varnish on the plaster has discolored. And to me, that's fine, because that's just the way it is. There's no need to take it off, because it shows the artist's working methods and materials, and it is what it is right now. So it isn't at all, what's important is to make it pristine and new, but it's important to preserve really the working methods and materials of Laredo Taft. So that's why when you walk around and look at some of the dioramas, some of them do look old. They were made in the 1930s, but that to me is fine because old things are old and we should just let them be old, but be well taken care of and protected. So I wanted to point out some of the restoration work we've been doing for this project. In this diorama, the Studio of Della Gracia, we had two things go on. One is the rear or the side window to the left was badly damaged when I first got here. Basically the way the window is made is it's a glass window. It has a veneer of string that probably is shellacked, and the shellac string is sticking to the glass, and then it had that wooden casement. When I found it, all the string had basically was droopy and delaminated, so we had to clean all of that up and re-adhere it. But then with the help of Fred Lance, who's a local carpenter, we fabricated a new window frame based on the Kenosha design and what I knew was supposed to be there, and then was able to put that all back together. The other fun restoration in this diorama are the two cartoon figures that are flanking Mary in the back in the archway. So those two paper cartoon figures were missing from the Elmwood dioramas, but they exist in Kenosha. So I went over to Kenosha one day and worked with their curator, Gina Vedette, and we took their cartoons from their diorama and photocopied them onto archival paper, and then I laminated them to an archival board and cut them out and put them in the back. So those are actually photocopy representations of the original. So that's one example. The other example is right next door in the studio of Michelangelo. Again, Fred Lance helped with this one. In studying the old photographs, we found that Michelangelo, who's right in the middle, you see his posture, he's leaning against something, and it never really made sense because he was just leaning there. And what was missing from the Elmwood diorama was what we didn't know at the time, but was the sawhorse. So we looked through the old archive photos and found that actually there would have been a sawhorse, and with Fred's help, he figured out the dimensions of what that would be and created a little sawhorse with that piece of wood on top that we could put back in there. So all of those restorations that we've done are also well documented and annotated on them somewhere so that anyone knows in the future if they're ever going back into these that there's no way that they're original to the piece, but that they're things that we have put in there to make the narrative make sense. So the other thing Fred helped us with was create this wood pedestal for the slave sculpture in the rear behind Michelangelo, that big white sculpture. That was again another studying the old photographs and seeing that statue actually should have been raised on a pedestal and not standing on the floor. So that was another recreation of Fred's. A fun thing that we found out in working on this diorama also was that in the process of cleaning and documenting all these figures, this figure of Moses in the front is actually one of the figures that wasn't fabricated by Taft in his studio. We think that that was a mail order piece that he bought because of the documentation on the bottom. It has a little maker's mark, a little metal stamp on the bottom that shows where it was fabricated. So everything, in all of these dioramas, Taft and his studio created custom for these dioramas except for this figure of Moses, which I think is really a fun fact. I just wanted to say in summary, and on a personal note, I'm just so grateful to be a part of this project. It has been so interesting and rewarding,
I think one of the best things about it is actually how much community support and interest there is in it. You know, Laredo Taft, the more I've learned about him and seen what he's done, he just had a tremendous philanthropic spirit, you know, not only monetarily, but just with his time and his enthusiasm. And I think he was so much about, you know, bolstering community, and that's what these dioramas were. You know, early on in his career, he had this vision of creating a communal museum out in California, which was, you know, on a monumental scale of bringing over, you know, his vision involved bringing over all these sculptures that he considered beautiful and wanting to show them to the community. And at that time, it was pretty unusual because art, you know, at the turn of the century was really for the wealthy and the privileged. And so his idea of making art communal and open to everyone and to showing them the world of beauty and life was just really visionary and very, just a beautiful, beautiful message, I think, to community. So, you know, it's really exciting to be a part of that. And in my little way, and what I love about conservation is, you know, a little bit like Taft. I don't want to say at all that I'm on that scale, but art conservation is very much about preserving culture, and that's, you know, what I feel like my gift is being able to help the community by preserving culture. So thank you, Elmwood.